This is not a video about minimalism. I'm not turning into Mattie McDonagh or anything. It's also not a video about making money. It's not even a video about saving money. It's a video about spending money, but doing it better. And I don't mean better like in a way that will just improve your own life or in terms of investing or planning for retirement. I mean better as in morally better. Better for other people, including those you don't know. I want to discuss the idea that the question, how should I spend my money, is not just a question of taste or comfort or which color iPhone I prefer. It's an ethical question, the answer to which should radically change the way that we handle our finances. Here's something to get you thinking. Imagine you're on a walk, alone, in the middle of the day, and you pass by a small body of water. And you begin to hear thrashing and screaming, and you realize that the sound is coming from a drowning child just a few meters from where you're stood. Luckily, the water is pretty shallow, and it'll be really easy for you to wade in and save the child. But you'll ruin your shoes and your trousers. You'll get them all muddy and you'll have to replace them. Your shoes cost maybe $100, so you decide not to wade in and not to save the child. You let them die because you want to save your money. But hold on, isn't that just the most evil thing you've ever heard? A person refusing to save this child's life because they want to save $100 to spend on their shoes? This would be morally outrageous. We'd consider it an ethical crime to refuse to save a child from drowning to save a little bit of money. Of course, $100 is a lot of money for a lot of people, but for someone willing to spend it on trendy shoes, it can't be life or death. Yet, isn't this exactly what we do every time we refuse to give money to charity because we want to spend it on shoes or a new phone or a fancy dinner? Consider a similar scenario. A child is dying not from drowning in front of you, but from malaria, starvation, or diarrhea on the other side of the globe. If you receive an appeal from a charity saying you can save this child's life if you'll only donate some money, and you refuse so that you can spend it on other things that you don't really need, isn't this just the same as walking past the drowning child and pretending not to see them? This is the challenge raised by Peter Singer in his famous essay, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, and later in his book, The Life You Can Save. I'd recommend both if you're interested in challenging yourself. After reading the second of these for the first time, I remember going on a walk and seriously considering selling most of my non-essential possessions and giving the money to charity. Singer's argument is an amazingly simple one. If it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening, without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought, morally, to do it. Now, this principle seems obvious when applied to the drowning child. We can prevent something bad, the child drowning, by sacrificing nothing of comparable moral importance. Our shoes and our trousers are nowhere near as valuable as a child's life, so we ought to do it. But this principle doesn't specify who the bad thing is happening to or where they are in the world. It just says that if we can prevent it, we should. And so if someone is dying of malaria on the other side of the world, and we can take the money we were going to spend buying a new necklace or eating at a restaurant, and instead donate it to the Against Malaria Foundation, saving that person's life, we should always do it, right? For some reason, these situations feel different. Whilst most of us would all agree that you're obligated to save the drowning child, most people think that giving to charity is, though a good thing to do, not something that you morally have to do in the same way. It's a virtue, but not an obligation. There seems to be something much more urgent and compelling about the child drowning right in front of you. But why? Well, many people's first suggestion is that maybe the reason these situations are different is because the child drowning is right in front of you, whereas the person dying of malaria is much, much further away on the other side of the globe, and so shouldn't be as much of a concern for us. But since when did distance dictate our moral obligations? This response is saying that the further away someone is from us, the less of an obligation we have to prevent their suffering. Okay, well, let's test this principle. Suppose that an innocent child is being slowly electrocuted in the back of a car. That car is driving away from me, but luckily I have a wireless controller that I can use to switch off the electrical current. And I should obviously press the button to save the child, but is it the case that the further away the car gets from me, the less of an obligation I have to press it? Surely how far away the car is makes no difference to my obligation to save the child. In other words, it shouldn't matter if the child is drowning in front of me or on the other side of the world. The distance shouldn't change our moral obligations. In fact, It's actually easier for you to save a child on the other side of the world than to save one who is dying, say, next door, since nowadays you can do it by simply donating some money online. If Singer's principle is correct, there should be just as much of an obligation to do so. But there's a big problem with this, right? If we agree with Singer's principle that we should always prevent something bad if we can do so without sacrificing anything comparably important, then we're led to a kind of moral paralysis. Every single time you buy anything that you don't strictly need, you could spend that money on a charity providing things that disadvantaged people elsewhere in the world really do need. But how far do we take this? Do we never eat out at a fancy restaurant? Do we never buy new clothes until our old ones are literally unwearable? Do we never buy a TV or a games console or a mobile phone? In fact, should I not sell my current phone and my shoes and all of my non-essential possessions and give the money to charity? Things like phones and shoes are obviously not as important as an innocent child's life, and so Singer's principle seems to suggest that we should never buy these things and possibly sell the ones we have because we could better spend the money on charity for people who really need it. So here we land on the biggest objection to Singer's famous argument. Isn't this all just far too much to ask of the average person? I mean, sure, someone who did act like this, selling all of their things, would surely be virtuous and commendable, but can we say that we all have an obligation to live like this? I mean, should I never shave my face because the cost of a razor could be spent on charity and my facial hair is never as important as a child's life? Surely this is too far. And this is known as the demandingness objection. The principle that Peter Singer presents is just too demanding for most people to abide by. Okay, but does the fact that a moral theory is challenging for us to live by have any relevance to its truth? If something is true, the fact that it's difficult for us to accept it doesn't make it any less true. Can demandingness really ever count against the truth of a moral theory? Well, Peter Singer doesn't think so, as he told me himself.
How likely it is that people will ever comply with a moral theory is independent from the truth of the moral theory.
And the moral theory is true regardless of
whether anybody will ever act on it.
Yet, I have a suggestion. Perhaps the demandingness of a moral theory is part of what makes it true or false. The reason it's so obvious that we should save the drowning child is because giving up one pair of shoes isn't too demanding. It's still quite demanding in that you have to buy new shoes, but it's nowhere near demanding enough to let the child die. But as the demandingness increases, perhaps our moral obligation decreases. For instance, if you had to give up not just your shoes, but also your expensive phone, you should probably still save the child, but perhaps it's ever so slightly less obvious. And taking this further, what if you had to give up your car or your home or your life savings to save the child? Maybe you think that you would still have an obligation to do so, but it seems like the obligation is at least lessened when compared to just having to give up your shoes. So following this, in a situation where you would have to sell literally all of your non-essential possessions to give the money to charity, we might be able to say that this is indeed too demanding to be morally obligatory. This doesn't mean that it wouldn't be a virtuous thing to do, of course, but we can't say that you have to. The philosopher Travis Timmerman wrote an essay in 2015 called "Sometimes There Is Nothing Wrong with Letting a Child Drown." Now, on the face of it, that does sound pretty grim, but Timmerman is specifically addressing this demandingness objection to the drowning child example. Timmerman writes that Peter Singer's use of the drowning child to prove that we should always be giving to charity is a disanalogy. It's not an accurate comparison. The reason for this is that when you think about Singer's argument, the implicit assumption is that drowning child is an anomalous event. That is, we're imagining a situation in which you have to save one drowning child once, not a situation in which millions of children are dying all around you and you constantly have to save them. These situations are different. And with something like malaria or poverty or starvation, it's more akin to this second situation. We're not talking about an isolated incident requiring one single tiny sacrifice. We're talking about a continual stream of suffering people and a never-ending opportunity to save more and more of them by sacrificing more and more of your finances. With this in mind, Timmerman constructs what he thinks is a more analogous situation to poverty and world suffering. Imagine you get a phone call from the bank telling you that hackers have accessed your account and are taking $200 out of it every 5 minutes. And the only way to stop this is by going to the bank and holding your account. And due to some legal loophole, the bank doesn't have to reimburse you for your lost funds. And if your account is emptied, they're going to start seizing your possessions to make up for the debt that's being created by these hackers. Now, luckily, you only live about 5 minutes away from the bank, and so you can stop this pretty much immediately. But on your way to the bank, you see a large space filled with hundreds of shallow ponds, each of which has a child drowning in it. Suppose each child takes 5 minutes to save. You now have a pretty horrible choice. How many children will you save before going to the bank? When you go to the bank, the remaining children will die, they'll drown, but for every child you decide to save, money and eventually your possessions are being lost. And what's worse, this situation repeats every single day, and there's nothing that you or the bank can do about it. I think it's fairly obvious that you should save at least some of the children, right? Supposing you're not already living in poverty or something, to allow them to die so that you can go straight to the bank and save all your money would be a terrible thing to do. But surely it's equally true that you don't have an obligation to save all of the children. Right? This would mean you could never go to the bank and all your possessions would be seized. I think it's clear that at some point you should be allowed to stop saving this endless number of children drowning in order to prevent the bank from seizing the things that you really need, like your house and your car. But should you be allowed to save enough money for non-essential things? If this situation does repeat every single day of your life, should you be expected to spend your entire time saving children and constantly losing money and possessions only up until the point where you start losing things that you absolutely need? This would mean that for the rest of your life, you can never go to the theatre or a concert, you can never buy a birthday present for someone, or go on holiday or travel, or get a mobile phone, or even go out for a drink, because none of these are things you strictly need. And you could only have enough money for them by allowing some of the children to die and going to the bank. But it seems unfair to expect someone to act in this way and to never be able to enjoy any of the pleasantries of life. Timmerman concludes that in this weird situation, you should be allowed to go to the bank, to save your money, and to spend it on nice things, including, sometimes, things you don't strictly need. And I think this is a plausible suggestion, unless you want to lose literally all of your non-essential possessions and experiences. But crucially and obviously, this doesn't mean that you can refuse to save any of the children on the way to the bank. Sure, you don't have to save them all, you probably can't, but that doesn't mean that you don't have an obligation to save at least some of them, and probably quite a few of them. It's difficult to know exactly how many you should save, and respectively, exactly how many non-essential things you should be able to buy in your life, but we can know for sure that you have to save at least some of them, and probably minimize your non-essential spending quite a bit in order to do so. This, to me, is the most appropriate analogy to giving to charity. It's difficult to know exactly how much money you should give to save people from suffering and dying across the world, but we can know for sure that you need to donate at least some, and probably minimize your non-essential spending in order to do so. Assuming, of course, that you're someone with some level of expendable income and you're not living in poverty or something. Now, sometimes we can allow ourselves to indulge in nice things, but not so much that it prevents us from a significant amount of charitable giving in order to save lives, regardless of where they are in the world. Perhaps you might decide to give a fixed percentage of your yearly income to various charities. Perhaps you might decide every time you make a non-essential purchase to donate the same amount of money to a charity at the same time. Perhaps you might donate your time rather than your money to charitable causes. But whichever you think is the most practical, we should certainly be giving more than we currently are, at least on average. And whilst I think that donating literally all of our non-essential money to charity is too demanding, donating none at all is just as good as walking right past the sea of drowning children and straight into the bank, or refusing to save the single drowning child so as not to ruin your shoes. Any time a person dies or suffers unnecessarily, it's a tragedy, especially since the remedy in so many cases is for us to simply give a little more. A link to thelifeyoucansave.org is in the description if you want help getting started with charitable giving. So no, don't sell all your possessions. And don't feel too bad for enjoying your life, even though there are other people suffering in the world. But don't spend too excessively, and don't refuse to give to charity at all. People's lives are at stake, so take this seriously, but do save a good amount of money for things that will make you happy too. And since you're not going to spend all your money on charity, and you're going to keep some for yourself to spend on nice things, let me suggest one thing that you can spend it on: internet security. That's right, I want to take a moment to thank ExpressVPN for sponsoring today's video. Your freedom to browse the internet safely and securely is at risk if you don't use a VPN. Every time you connect to an unencrypted Wi-Fi network, hackers on the same network can steal your data, your passwords, your financial information, even your emails. On top of that, when you do browse the internet, which if you're like me is something you do fairly often, your internet service provider can see everything you do. Everything. And going incognito isn't going to do anything to stop them. These providers can perfectly legally sell your data to ad companies too. In my country, internet service providers are required to keep a log of all the websites I visit and the apps I use and the conversations that I have. ExpressVPN encrypts your data and stops all of this from happening. And since your location is hidden, one of my favorite perks of using ExpressVPN is the ability to access online content from all over the world. This means that I can enjoy US or Canadian Netflix despite living in the UK, and I can watch content that's restricted by region and without anybody tracking my data. So, if you want a whole 3 months of this completely for free, then click the link in the description, expressvpn.com/cosmic skeptic, and secure your safety when browsing online. I also want to say a huge thanks to my supporters on Patreon, especially to my top tier patrons, without whom I simply couldn't do what I do. If you like my videos, please do consider becoming a supporter at patreon.com/cosmic skeptic. But as always, I've been Alex O'Connor. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.